The train pulled into South Pass City just after noon, its whistle echoing off the surrounding hills and scattering a flock of pigeons from the station roof. And among the dozen or so passengers who stepped down onto the wooden platform that day was a young woman named Abigail Foster, 22 years old, clutching a single worn suitcase in one hand and a letter in the other. A letter she had read so many times over the past 3 weeks that the creases had begun to wear thin along the folds. She had traveled nearly 900 miles from her aunt's home in Ohio to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Elijah Marsh who had placed an advertisement in a matrimonial newspaper seeking a wife, a woman of good character willing to help him manage his household, and Abigail, orphaned young and dependent on the grudging charity of an aunt who made her poverty felt in 100 small daily cruelties, had answered that advertisement with a kind of desperate hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Elijah Marsh had written back promptly, his letters careful and formal but not unkind, describing his small cattle operation outside South Pass City, his need for a partner in life who could help him run a proper household, and though he never once mentioned love, not in any of the 6 letters they exchanged over those 3 months of correspondence, Abigail had allowed herself to hope that perhaps love might grow between 2 decent people willing to build a life together, the way it sometimes did for women in her circumstances who had no better prospects than a stranger's earnest advertisement. He had promised to meet her train himself, had described what he would be wearing, a gray coat and a black hat, so that she would know him among the crowd, and Abigail had spent the entire 900-mile journey rehearsing in her mind what she might say to this stranger who was to become her husband, practicing a composure she did not entirely feel. But there was no man in a gray coat waiting on the platform when she stepped down from the train. She waited, at first patiently, telling herself he had perhaps been delayed by some ranch emergency, a sick animal or a broken fence, the ordinary business of frontier life that could not always be scheduled around a train's arrival. She waited an hour, then 2, watching the platform empty of its other passengers as they were collected by waiting families or made their way into town, until she alone remained, seated now on her suitcase against the station wall, the letter clutched to her chest, the golden afternoon light slowly shifting toward evening as the shadows lengthened across the platform boards. It was the station master, an elderly man with kind eyes who had watched her vigil with growing concern, who finally approached and gently informed her that he had heard, through the ordinary channels of small-town gossip that traveled faster than any telegraph, that Elijah Marsh had married a widow from the neighboring county just 2 weeks prior, a woman he had apparently been courting quietly even while corresponding with Abigail, and that he had simply neglected, whether through cowardice or carelessness, to send word calling off the arrangement. Abigail received this news with a particular stillness of a person absorbing a blow too large to process all at once, her mind refusing, for several long moments, to fully accept what the station master's gentle words actually meant, that she had traveled 900 miles from everything and everyone she knew to marry a man who had already given himself to someone else, and that she now sat alone in a town where she knew not a single living soul, with barely enough money left in her purse to cover a week's lodging, let alone passage back to Ohio, back to an aunt who had made abundantly clear that Abigail's departure had been a relief rather than a loss. It was in this state, tears finally breaking free of the composure she had maintained throughout the long afternoon, that Nathaniel Cole found her, though he very nearly walked past without noticing. So preoccupied was he with the errand that had brought him to the station that day, collecting a crate of supplies his sister had ordered from Denver. He was 36 years old, a widower these past 2 years since his wife Rebecca had succumbed to a lung ailment that had taken her slowly and painfully over the course of a long winter, leaving him alone to raise their daughter Grace, now 7 years old, a bright and curious child who had inherited her mother's dark curls and her father's stubborn chin. Nathaniel ran a modest horse ranch just north of town, breeding and training working stock for the surrounding cattle operations, and he had built, in the 2 years since Rebecca's death, a life that functioned adequately but joylessly, a routine of chores and childcare and quiet evenings that felt less like living than like simply enduring. He noticed Abigail because Grace noticed her first, tugging at her father's sleeve and pointing toward the crying woman on the suitcase with a blunt, unguarded compassion of a child who had not yet learned to look away from other people's pain. "Papa, that lady is sad," Grace said, and something in her small, certain voice made Nathaniel actually stop and look properly, rather than simply registering another stranger among the ordinary traffic of the station platform. He approached carefully, mindful of startling her, and crouched slightly to bring himself more to her eye level rather than looming over her the way a tall man might inadvertently do to a woman already frightened and alone. "Ma'am," he said, "forgive me for intruding, but my daughter noticed you've been sitting here a good while, and it looked like you might be in some trouble. Is there something I can help with?" Abigail looked up at him, this stranger with kind, tired eyes and a small girl clutching his hand, and found herself, against every instinct toward pride and self-sufficiency that had carried her through a difficult childhood, simply telling him the truth, the whole humiliating truth, because she had no strength left to construct a more dignified version of her circumstances. She told him about the advertisement, the letters, the promised meeting that had never come, the news of Elijah Marsh's hasty marriage to another woman, and as she spoke she watched something harden in Nathaniel Cole's expression, not directed at her but at the absent Elijah Marsh, a flash of genuine anger at a man's careless cruelty toward a woman who had trusted him enough to cross 900 miles on the strength of his word. "That man ought to be ashamed of himself," Nathaniel said when she finished. "Leaving a woman stranded without so much as a letter of warning. That's about as low a thing as I've heard of a man doing in this county, and I've heard of plenty of low things." He was quiet a moment, considering, and Grace watched him with the particular attentiveness of a child who had learned to read her father's silences for meaning. "I don't suppose you have anywhere in town to stay tonight?" "No," Abigail admitted. "I have a little money, enough for perhaps a week at the boarding house if it's not too dear, but after that I don't rightly know what I'll do. I can't go back to my aunt's, not really. There's no place for me there anymore, and I've no other family left living." Nathaniel straightened, and when he spoke again there was a directness in his voice that Abigail would come to recognize, in the weeks ahead, as characteristic of him, a man who did not waste words on hesitation once he'd made up his mind about something. "I've got a proposition for you, ma'am, and I'll understand entirely if you think it forward or improper given we've known each other all of 10 minutes, but I find myself thinking it's better to say a true thing plainly than to dance around it out of politeness. I lost my wife 2 years back. I've got a ranch that needs a woman's hand in the house, and a daughter who could use more female influence in her life than I'm able to provide on my own, being as I'm not much good at braiding hair or explaining certain things a girl her age is starting to ask about. I'm not proposing marriage, not straight off, not to a stranger, because that wouldn't be fair to either of us, and I expect you've had quite enough of hasty arrangements with strangers for one lifetime. But I could offer you honest work as a housekeeper and companion to Grace, a proper wage, your own room, respectable and above board, with old Mrs. Kowalski from town coming by regular enough to see everything's done proper for your reputation's sake. It would give you a roof and a wage while you decide what you truly want to do with your circumstances, without the pressure of deciding anything more than that just yet." Abigail stared at him, searching his weathered face for some hint of the same deception that had characterized her correspondence with Elijah Marsh, some hidden expectation lurking beneath the plain words of his offer, but she found nothing there but the same tired, earnest kindness she'd noted from the moment he approached. And Grace, still holding her father's hand, looked up at Abigail with an expression of such open, hopeful entreaty that something in Abigail's chest, some frozen place that had been guarding itself against further disappointment all afternoon, began, cautiously, to thaw. "Why would you do this?" she asked. The same question she would later realize she asked of nearly everyone who showed her unexpected kindness, as though kindness itself were a puzzle she had not yet learned to simply accept at face value. "You don't know me at all." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "But I know what it looks like when somebody's been dealt a rotten hand through no fault of their own, and I've got room enough in my house and my life to help set it right, at least for a while. Besides," and here a small rueful smile crossed his face, "Grace has decided you're staying, and in my experience it's easier to just go along with what Grace decides than to argue the point." Abigail laughed then, a small, surprised sound that felt strange after the day's grief, and something about that laugh, unguarded and genuine, settled the matter for both of them. She rode out to the Cole ranch that evening in Nathaniel's wagon, Grace chattering beside her the entire way about horses and chickens, and a particular cat that lived in the barn and refused to be caught by anyone but Grace herself. And by the time they arrived at the modest but well-tended ranch house, its windows glowing gold against the deepening dusk, Abigail felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon after the day's devastating disappointment. A small, tentative flicker of possibility. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Abigail with how naturally it came to her, rising early to help with breakfast, working alongside old Mrs. Kowalski, who came by 3 mornings a week and quickly became fond of Abigail's earnest willingness to learn, teaching Grace her letters in the afternoons and listening to the girl's endless stream of observations about the world, and in the evenings, after Grace had been put to bed, sitting with Nathaniel on the porch as the ranch settled into darkness around them, talking about small things at first, the weather, the horses, the price of feed, and gradually about larger things, her childhood, the mother she barely remembered, his marriage to Rebecca, and the particular grief of watching someone he loved fade slowly rather than being taken all at once. "I used to think a slow loss would be easier to bear than a sudden one," he told her one evening, some 6 weeks into her time at the ranch, "because you'd have time to prepare, to say what needed saying. But I don't think that's true. I think it just means the grief has longer to dig itself in before it's done, and then you're left carrying the weight of it long after the person's actually gone, remembering not just who they were, but who they were becoming as the illness took more of them each week." "I'm sorry," Abigail said. "That sounds like a particular kind of hard." It was. It is, some days still. But Grace helps. She's got her mother's curiosity about everything, asks questions I can't always answer, but I find I don't mind not having the answers so much as I used to. Feels less like a failing and more like just being honest with her. He looked over at Abigail then, in the lantern light of the porch, and something in his expression carried a question he hadn't yet found words for. "You've been good for her, you know. Good for this house generally. I don't think I realized how quiet things had gotten around here until you came, and it wasn't quiet anymore. I didn't expect to feel at home anywhere again," Abigail admitted. Not after Elijah Marsh's letter. Not after realizing how easily a stranger could simply discard an arrangement without a second thought for what it might cost the other person. "I came here half convinced I'd learn the same lesson twice. That kindness always has a hidden price eventually." "And has it? Has there been a hidden price?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "No," she said finally. "Not from you. Not from Grace. I think perhaps I've simply been waiting to be disappointed because it was easier than trusting that some people mean exactly what they say. It was perhaps inevitable, given the slow accumulation of such evenings, such honest conversations, that something deeper than employer and housekeeper, deeper even than friendship, began to take root between them, though neither spoke of it directly for several more months, both cautious of moving too quickly, mindful of the particular wounds each carried and unwilling to risk causing further harm through hasty presumption. It was Grace, in the end, with the same blunt clarity that had first drawn her father's attention to Abigail on that station platform, who finally forced the matter into the open, asking over supper one evening, with no apparent awareness of the weight her question carried, whether Abigail was going to be her new mama now, since she certainly acted like one and Grace didn't see why they should all keep pretending otherwise. Nathaniel nearly choked on his coffee, and Abigail felt her face flush crimson. But in the awkward silence that followed, both adults found themselves, for perhaps the first time, actually looking at each other without the careful deflection they'd maintained for months, and what passed between them in that look was answer enough for both of them, even before either spoke a word. "Out of the mouths of babes," Nathaniel said eventually, a rough laugh escaping him. "Grace, sweetheart, why don't you go check on that cat of yours in the barn for a spell?" Once Grace had gone, practically skipping with the satisfaction of having said something important, Nathaniel turned back to Abigail with an expression more serious than she'd yet seen from him. "I meant what I said back at the station, that I wasn't proposing marriage to a stranger, and I want you to know that wasn't a delay tactic or a lack of interest, it was respect, because you deserve the chance to know your own mind free of pressure after what that other man put you through. But it's been 6 months now, and I don't think either of us is a stranger to the other anymore. I think you know me about as well as anyone's known me since Rebecca passed, and I know you better than I expected to know anyone again, and I find myself thinking that what I feel for you has grown into something a good deal more than gratitude for good housekeeping, though the housekeeping's appreciated too." "Nathaniel," Abigail said softly. "Are you asking me something?" "I suppose I am, though I seem to be making a hash of actually asking it. Abigail Foster, I love you, and I think I've loved you for a good while longer than I've let myself admit. And I'd be honored, truly honored, if you'd consider staying on not as my housekeeper but as my wife, if that's something you could want, given everything that first brought you to this town." Abigail felt tears rise again, but these were nothing like the tears she'd shed on that station platform months before. Tears of grief and abandonment and fear for an uncertain future. These were tears of something she'd nearly stopped believing she'd ever feel again. A settled, certain joy, the sense of a door opening rather than closing. "I came to South Pass City to marry a man who never once told me he loved me in 6 letters of correspondence," she said. "I think I always sensed, somewhere underneath the hope I was trying to hold on to, that whatever we might have built together would have been missing something essential. I don't feel that with you, Nathaniel. I haven't felt that with you since the very first evening, sitting on your porch, when you told me about Rebecca, and I understood that you were a man capable of loving someone completely, not just adequately. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed that spring, in a small ceremony at the ranch with Mrs. Kowalski weeping happily and Grace serving as the world's most delighted flower girl, scattering petals with far more enthusiasm than precision. And the town of South Pass City, which had first known Abigail only as the mail-order bride abandoned on its train platform, came in time to know her as Mrs. Cole, the woman who had turned a devastating betrayal into the foundation of a family more loving than the one she'd originally traveled 900 miles to build. Grace grew up telling anyone who would listen the story of how she'd known, the very moment she saw the sad lady at the station, that her papa needed to bring her home, and how right she'd been about it, a fact she never tired of reminding both her parents throughout her childhood and well into the years beyond. And Nathaniel, on quiet evenings when he and Abigail sat together on that same porch where he'd first confessed his feelings, often thought that Elijah Marsh's carelessness, the cruelest disappointment of Abigail's young life, had somehow become the very circumstance that led her to the family she was always meant to have, proof, if he'd ever needed it, that sometimes the worst days carried within them the seeds of everything that would eventually make a life worth living. If this story of heartbreak turned into hope touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional tales of love and second chances on the American frontier.